In the name of one God, creator, redeemer, and sustainer of our lives, amen. I've been tasked today with the charge to do a stewardship sermon. And I actually liked the challenge of doing a stewardship sermon based on that Old Testament text. The people are giving their gold and making false gods. I felt that would be rich. But given what's happening this week in Israel and Palestine, it felt a little tone deaf, actually, not to speak to that occasion. Because there is real suffering and grief going on. I mean, whenever there's been this brutal aggression and terror and innocent people have lost their lives, we're called to respond with grief, basically. And I think many of us have felt that grief. It's dominated the news. It's been in the news. We're in the midst of a war going on. And I feel like I should address the occasion, and yet I feel inadequate, quite honestly, to the task. I think the best thing we could do would be to sit here and grieve for the next 20 minutes. And yet I don't think we're necessarily in the headspace or heart space to do that authentically. So I'm not going to ask that. So I will try to reflect on my own experience. I'm aware of just the conflict and angst and grief I feel internally. So I'll just share some of that with you around my own experience. Because I think it's relevant to who we are. We are part of a faith tradition that is actually deeply rooted in Judaism. We have a sacred text. We call it the Bible, and many of us feel that the Bible is like just one book, and it's actually not. It's a library. It's a library of 66 different books in 2 volumes, and one volume we call the New Testament, and one volume we call the Old Testament, which is actually a misnomer because the Old Testament is actually the Hebrew Scriptures. It's the Jewish Scriptures. If you walk into any Jewish synagogue, you're going to see a book called Tanakh, which is the Old Testament. It's a slightly different translation with a slightly different order of the books, but it's the same text. And so all of our stories and arise out of that text and that tradition. Jesus, our spiritual leader, was a rabbi. He was a Jewish man. He was a rabbi, and his disciples were all Jewish men and women, and they kept kosher, and they followed the Sabbath, and they believed in male circumcision. And so all our stories arise out of kind of these deep roots of Judaism, and then we tell these stories. We tell this Old Testament story about God, and how God makes a covenant with God's people and says, I will be your God, and you will be my people, and your descendants will be as numerous as the stars of the sky, and I will lead you to a promised land. And that's where our Old Testament text today picks up. And the people, Moses has been on Sinai talking with God, and the people of God are angsty and nervous and longing for something concrete to connect to the divine in some way. And so they ask Aaron to make them a God that they can see and touch and feel. And they are in the midst of worshiping this God, and God, Yahweh, kind of throws a tantrum on the top of Sinai. He's aware of what's going on, and he says, Moses, your people are doing this thing, and I'm about to destroy them. And Moses responds, they're not my people. They're your people. You made a covenant with them to be their God and to lead them to a promised land. And God's like, you're right. And God changes God's mind, right? And our tendency is to think that the Old Testament, somehow the Jewish Scriptures, is a God of wrath, and there's definitely some wrath in this story. But the point of the story is that God isn't wrathful. God changes God's mind. And I learned that when I was at Yale, and I did my first Old Testament class, and Robert Wilson, who was the professor, was like, we're not going to use the NRSV, we're going to use the Tanakh. And you're going to read, and your invitation is to read these as Jewish scriptures, not see it through a Christian lens. And it was in reading those scriptures that I did encounter that the God of these Hebrew scriptures is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. That is who the Jewish God is. Merciful, gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. That's the Old Testament God, despite the wrathful stories, right? And I needed to hear that because I grew up in a Christian tradition that we've lost sight of our own connection. We've lost sight of our own Jewish roots in a lot of ways. And so when I was at Yale, I hung out with some of the Jewish students and had shared meals with them and learned more about their tradition. A friend of mine invited me to go to synagogue with him, and I went to services on Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, and I heard a confession of sin that rocked my world and a proclamation of grace that rocked my world. And then we went to Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah and celebrated the New Year. So we as a people, we as a faith tradition, have these deep connections with the Jewish tradition. We tell these stories about God promising a land for a people. I began to be aware of that, I think, when I was probably 9, 10 years old, watching TV. This was back in the day when it was going to be ABC or CBS or NBC, or if you're really edgy, maybe PBS or the independent station. And there was some sort of TV series on the Holocaust. I don't remember the name of it, but as a 9 and 10-year-old boy, being exposed to that story and the tragedy and the suffering and the horror of what happened to the Jewish people, and became aware of that this is in many ways the culminating instance of a long history of anti-Semitism, often perpetrated on the part of Christians, that I began to be repentant, right? That I began to be open to who these people, the longing and the desire of the Jewish people for home, for safety, for security, for a place to call their own. And it's in many ways been the story of the Jewish people, all the way back going to our Old Testament text, right? So the tragedy that was perpetrated this week at the hands of Hamas on the part of the Jewish people, it's not just the suffering and the horror of the death of the individuals. It's that their sense of security and safety has been disrupted. Right? It's been equated to our 9/11. And you remember historically how in that act our sense of safety and our sense of security was shattered. The world became a much more dangerous place. We ourselves entered into the Iraq War as a result. So I bear that. You know, I hear that. I spent a summer in Israel studying Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And while I was there, I was able to visit my cousin, who actually lived and worked in the Gaza Strip. And so my cousin, evangelical, went to Fuller Seminary, started working initially in Israel, helping repatriate Russian Jews in Jerusalem. Did that for a number of years. You know, his whole family learned Hebrew, and then he decided to move to the Gaza Strip and work with Palestinians instead. And so he, took his 6 kids and his wife and moved to Gaza. They settled in Rafah, which is a refugee camp near the border with Egypt. His wife and daughters all wore hijab, right? They tried to blend in as much as they could. The State Department told my cousin, "You are a fool to be doing this. They will kidnap you and extort you because you're an American." And my cousin, who is bold, did it anyway. And he started working with the people and discerned that culturally Palestinians marry their cousins, their first cousins. It's just culturally been part of the practice. And that can lead to a congenital heart defect that can be corrected surgically if you have the means to do it. But they didn't have the means to do it in Gaza. And so because he had done this ministry with Jews in Jerusalem and knew all these Jewish doctors, he persuaded these Jewish doctors to agree to operate on these Palestinian babies who are both Christian and Muslim. So operate on these Palestinian babies financed by evangelical Christians in North America and Europe, which is an amazing thing if you think about it, right? Jewish doctors operating on Muslim babies financed by Christians. It's an impulse towards peace. It's an impulse towards reconciliation. And the people in his area recognized that he was a man of God. And so there's space in Islam for the people of the book. Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians are all recognized as people of the book in Islam, and are respected for our faith. And so even though my cousin was an American and the State Department thought he was in danger, the people in his area protected him, and the people in his area were specifically Hamas. So this was 25 years ago. I should specify that this was 25 years ago that I would have been there. Hamas was a different organization, or it was still, I think, considered a terrorist organization at that point. But the leadership of the Gaza Strip at that point was the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And the people in Gaza felt they were corrupt because they were using the money they were getting to build big mansions on the Mediterranean rather than using it for the needs of the people. And so what Hamas was doing was stepping in and doing the charity work that the PLO should have been doing with the poor. And so that's how Hamas was actually gaining the support of the people, because they were helping them in need. And so when I was there, my cousin, this was the very people who would be kidnapping him, who the State Department was worried that was going to be kidnapping him, but they were actually respected what he was doing in terms of his ministry because they saw him helping people. So when I was there, I went to go visit, and I spent 2 different weeks in Gaza learning about the situation. Israel as a state was established in 1948 as a response to the Holocaust. I mean, there had been migrations of Jewish people into Israel from the late 1800s on, various series of migrations, and there was a Zionist movement that had been developing. But in response to the anti-Semitism through the rest of the world and this longing for the Jewish people for a homeland and a safe place to be, and after the Holocaust, the UN decides to go ahead and create the State of Israel as a response, in part, to the injustice and horror of the Holocaust. So the establishment of the state is an attempt to undo the injustice and harm that had been done to Jewish people. But in the process, many people who are already in the land were displaced from their lands. And so the residents of Gaza, which is basically an area 4 to 8 miles wide and 25 miles long, the majority of them are descendants of displaced people. They still think of it as a refugee camp. And in many ways, Gaza is the world's largest prison because the people there cannot get out. They don't have any statehood. Their state is not recognized. So they can't get a visa. They can't get passports. They're stuck, basically, in this strip of land. There's now 2.4 million people stuck in this strip of land, and they live lives of despair. When I was there, and so what's happened is in the move to rectify one injustice, another injustice was created. And that's not a recipe for peace. You can't have peace by creating injustice. The tension there, and that tension has characterized and has simmered since 1948, and is the backdrop for everything that's happening right now as we speak. And when I was in Gaza, I was keenly aware that if you took any American and put them in this situation and had them stand in the shoes of these people, we would not tolerate it. We too would rise up, right? And I don't think that violence is the answer, and I would not advocate violence, and I condemn the actions that have been taken, the violent actions that have been taken. But we need to understand that these people are trapped, and if we stood in their shoes, we would resonate and understand why they're doing what they're doing. I don't know. When I was there were two young men who offered to take me on a tour of Gaza City. And so I went with them, spent the night. Both of them considered themselves members of Hamas. They tried to convert me to Islam, which was an interesting experience. It feels like evangelical Christians trying to convert you to Christianity. It was a very curious experience. But, so I spent the night, and I shared a room with one of these guys, and as he was going to bed, he was saying his prayers. And I asked him, I said, "What are you praying?" And he said, "Lord, let your servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen your salvation." It's the song of Simeon from the book of Luke that Simeon prays when Jesus comes. And here this Muslim man, a member of Hamas, before he was going to bed, was praying the song of Simeon. I was just struck by that, right? That was 25 years ago. Hamas is a bad government. Unfortunately, Israel also doesn't have the best of governments at this point, the best of leaders. There's been a failure of leadership, a profound failure of leadership on both sides for a long time. And I don't know what to do. I don't know what the solution is. It seems to be an intractable, awful situation. And we're in a state where innocent people are suffering and dying. We follow this Jewish rabbi named Jesus. And this Jewish rabbi called us to love our enemies, which is actually an Old Testament law, part of the Jewish law, to love your enemies and bless those who persecute you. I don't know what that looks like in this situation, right? We're called to be people of a third way, people who, as people of faith, we're called to actually pursue justice and pursue peace and guard the dignity of every human being. And what does that look like for us in this moment? To love your enemies, bless those who persecute you. I think if I was in either Israel or Gaza at this point, and somebody called me to love my enemy and bless those who are persecuting us, I would basically say, F you. And yet, that's what we're called to do. I mean, can you imagine if either of the sides that impulse to love your enemy, bless those who persecute, if that impulse was manifest on the leadership of either side of this equation, imagine how that would change things. I mean, that is the response. Actually, that is the only solution to an intractable situation. To love your enemy and bless those who persecute you. And yet, I don't know if we have and for the most part, it seems we don't have the capacity to do it. And yet, as people of faith, we aspire to it, right? I think all we can do is pray, may this be so. Amen.